Hello, and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be giving you a list of books that I have read this year that I have absolutely adored and that have stuck with me, like, in my mind over the course of the year, because, it's July now, or past the halfway point, and I already did my mid-year, check-in tag situation, but I opened my subscription box today after, not really checking BookTube at all for quite a few weeks, that regularly, because I was just busy, and I saw that, a bunch of people had posted this video, and I was like, well, let me hop on this. So, yeah, I am also going to be doing an honorary mention list video on my Patreon, so you should join my Patreon if you want to get access to that. But anyways, let's just get right into it. I have my little stack of books here, but a lot of these books I'm going to be talking about are not ones that I physically own yet. I mean, hopefully I will at some point. I also want to preface this by saying, on Goodreads, I give my star ratings to books basically immediately right after I finish reading the book. So some of these books are 4 or 4.5 star ratings. However, they have lingered in my mind longer than some other books that I've given 5 stars. So it's not completely accurate to my ratings in the moment after I'd finished reading those books. So just keep that in mind, I guess, if you think there's some discrepancies between my original star ratings and the list that I've compiled here now. But anyways, let's just get right into it. I'm probably going to go in order of most recently read to most further in time read. I didn't word that properly, but you know what the fuck I'm talking about. Basically, reverse chronological order. The first book I want to talk about as a favorite of the year so far, and that I think might be a favorite of the year in general, is Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell, which is a recent release, and I listened to the audiobook through Libro FM's audio influencer program, so thank you so much to Libro FM. And this book was so funny and phenomenal and touches on so many different issues without it being an issue book. It's more of just we're following this man as he is in the fucking trenches, mentally and in his relationships. Essentially, our main character is this guy who is gay and he works as a screenwriter, a comedy screenwriter for a TV show, and he lives in LA. He has a boyfriend long-term, and our main character has cerebral palsy, and it affects the way that he moves throughout the world, but not in a way in which he sort of suppresses that part of himself in a lot of various ways, and we see that play out throughout this book. But he's also a comedy writer, so he's really fucking funny, and essentially he and his boyfriend are in this gay friend group of bitchy LA middle-aged dudes, and it's just so funny to see his life, but it's also really sad because he is really going through it. He and his boyfriend are both alcoholics because they're wealthy white gays. It's sort of seen as oh, we just love wine, as opposed to we have a serious problem. And so there's that element going for him, and also the fact that he's really unhappy with his long-term relationship, despite the fact that he thinks that it's essentially the best that he's going to do, is how he views it, because his partner gives him this comfort and security and stability that he feels is the most that he can expect from his life as a disabled gay man. And essentially we see him stop, kind of check out of that relationship and start hooking up with these various sex workers and escorts. He knows it's not good, and he knows it's not good for him to be cheating on his boyfriend like this, but at the same time he can't stop, and he's just ultimately seeking to fill this void in his soul of not feeling sexually desirable because of his disability by paying people to have sex with him, essentially. And we see him unravel his life through this process, but also in that find healing for himself. It was a beautiful journey to go on, and it was also, again, fucking hilarious. I think this book is also somewhat autofictional, or very autofictional, because the author is also a comedy TV writer who is a cis gay man who has cerebral palsy. So it's autofiction, and I love autofiction. for the most part. So yeah, this is probably one of my favorite books of the year so far. And, you know, I read it pretty recently, but even then I still feel like it's been staying with me. It's been ruminating in my heart and in my soul because it just feels so real, and I really enjoyed it. The next book I want to talk about is The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I know I'm so late in the game for reading this now, but you gotta start somewhere with these like sci-fi classics and shit, right? So this book, I'm sure everyone like has a vague idea of the concept already, or like you know who Octavia E. Butler is, okay? You got to. Also, it's Cancer season still while I'm recording this, and she's a Cancer. I think she's a June Cancer. Is she a June Cancer? Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting. But anyways, I'm a Cancer too, so that's my bae. This book is absolutely brilliant. It is sci-fi that was written in like the late 80s, early 90s, and it was so prophetic, but like in the worst ways, right? So we're following our main character, who's this teenage girl who is the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and she lives in this like closed off community in the apocalyptic near future United States, in which there are rampant diseases and, you know, pandemic, and also the government is like crumbling and falling apart. A lot of people are suffering from lack of basic necessities, and she lives in a community that's essentially walled off from the rest of the craziness of the world, and it's like a community of different families who all help support each other. But our main character also has hyper empathy, which is this superpower that is for her kind of debilitating, in that whenever she sees someone experience pain, she will physically experience the same pain that that person does. And the book is formatted in this really interesting framework where the chapters are our main character's journal entries, essentially, and she's kind of creating this ideology, this religion called Earthseed, and she wants to like spread off into the stars or something. But we're essentially just seeing her survival and then her family dynamics, because she has younger siblings and of course other people in her community and of course her parents. It is a very, very interesting world and very intriguing world building going on that is very horrific. It is just trauma after trauma, but it's also so smart, obviously. And it was so compelling to read. Like, I could not put it down. I just kept on wanting to get through it. I loved this so much, and I'm so glad I got to it, because I know that I need to get through all of Octavia E. Butler's like books, but reading this like reified that for me, because she really is just the queen of like science fiction. And also it was so obvious when I was reading this that I mentioned this, or other people mentioned this when I was joining this, I think, book club like live show that I forgot who was hosting it, but someone was hosting a book club live show for Parable of the Sower, and I had just last minute joined, you know, and something that we had mentioned was it was so obvious that this series, or this book, Parable of the Sower, so deeply impacted N.K. Jemisin's writing of the 5th season, which is also another post-apocalyptic environmental collapse, near future America type vibes book, but in like a different way. But it's still, you could see the crossovers, and because the 5th season is probably my favorite sci-fi book or trilogy of literally all time, it was so interesting to read The Parable of the Sower now, because I could see the influence that that book had on Jemisin's writing and construction of the 5th season. So I really enjoyed Parable of the Sower, and I do want to finish the rest of the series, but that just hands down one of my favorite reads of the year so far, and I would highly recommend it if you haven't already picked it up. Alright, the next book I want to talk about is Siren Queen by Nevo, which I've already spoken about so extensively here, so I feel kind of redundant talking about it, but it's a lesbian historical fiction, magical realism, fabulous type novel following our main character, I think her name's Luli, who is an actress in like pre-Hays Code golden age of Hollywood vibes, right? And essentially we follow her ascent into the high ranks of Hollywood and the things that she has to give up and barter for in like magical terms, and also just her interpersonal relationships with the other people in Hollywood and in her life and in her community, and also with her family. It is very beautiful, and the magic system is kind of, it's not something that you can really pin down in any concrete way, because it is just this magical realism like vibe. It's not as like a stiff or structured world. It's more it's more vibes based magic, I guess, but it also feels very fairy tale like, because our main character needs to get into this like production company or whatever like a studio, right? And so the studio head is essentially like the big bad wolf, but he also has like magical capabilities, and it's just kind of crazy. But I really loved how the arc of the story is that our main character does not work to achieve the role of the main female lead, but instead takes on the villainous role in trying to oppose the racist stereotypes of casting that she would be subjected under being a Chinese girl in like the early 20th century in Hollywood. So instead she takes on another role that is, you know, also racially motivated, but not subservient in a way that her other potential casting positions would be. And so part of her barter, part of her soul trade, part of her life contract is that if she works at the studio, she won't play any maids or like have a fake accent or whatever. She will be playing the Siren Queen, which is this franchise at the studio, and she's playing the villain essentially. But our main character is also a lesbian, and she gets into various relationships with her co-stars and people and other people in Hollywood. And it's so interesting to see again like the writing of queer history in Hollywood and the imaginative like moments and elements of that are obviously rooted in the historical reality that a lot of people were closeted and were in PR relationships and still are, regarding hiding their own queerness. And yeah, I thought that it was so interesting also seeing like the queer coded nature of the actual movies, because, you know, we are on set and we also see the movie itself and we see these tragedies befall. I really enjoyed this and I would highly recommend it if that sounds interesting to you, but I also get why people like don't love it as much as I do. And I think my Goodreads review of it is describing it as like the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but better written and with like magic. And I still stand by that review, I guess. But if you're looking to fill the void left in you after reading The 7 Husbands, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you picking this up. I don't know if that's going to scratch the itch that you want. You know, I think it's just darker and of course fabulous. So those are elements that aren't found in other historical fiction books following a young woman seeking glamour. I really enjoyed this, and I definitely would say it's one of my favorites of the year, at least, you know, so far. Okay, the next book that is definitively a favorite of the year, 100%, is Against the Loveless World by Susan Abulhawa. This book it's crazy, but like in the best way. Basically, we are following a woman who is in prison, and she calls it, or everyone calls it, the Cube. And we're sort of alternating perspectives between her being locked up and then her explaining what led up to her being locked up. Our main character, her name is Nar. I'm really bad at remembering proper nouns and like the names of characters, you know, even if I do love the books, which all these books I do. But anyways, Nar is a political prisoner, and she is in this Israeli solitary confinement cell, and Nar is a Palestinian refugee who grew up in Kuwait and then experienced the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and then the American invasion of Iraq. And through all of this, she has experienced a lot of violence in her life because she originally married this guy who abandoned her after the beginnings of their marriage, and she also ends up getting into prostitution in order to support her family. And so we see her go through so much, but then eventually find love and, you know, work in the resistance and her community and love, and it's just beautiful. And Against the Loveless World is a quote from a James Baldwin novel, I believe. It's just so full of love, but it's like also very much about political resistance and rebellion, and I cried so much reading this. There are so many scenes and passages that are so deeply moving, and it's such a beautiful and heartbreaking portrait of life in the latter half, like in the late 20th century up till now, for this Palestinian woman who refuses to be framed as a victim and wants to tell her own story in the framing device of this book. But it was so beautiful, and I need more people to read it because I was blown away by how majestic this story was. And yeah, favorite of the year for sure. Now I want to talk about another autofictional or autobiographical novel called So Lucky by Nicola Griffith. We are following a lesbian middle-aged woman who has just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and then she becomes disabled and she has to navigate her life as someone with, I think, MS. Essentially, her brain stem is, or like part of her brain is like deteriorating over time, and it's really obviously impacting the way that she can live her life. She works at a nonprofit that helps people with HIV and AIDS, and then eventually loses her job because she's disabled. And then she basically gets involved with like disability activism online and then in forming community now, but she feels haunted by this impending doom that is like embodied through the shape dog or like a woman who's like haunting her. And she also gets in and out of various like romantic and sexual relationships, especially even like with her ex as well. And it's a really complicated emotional landscape for her to try to navigate, obviously having been disabled in the second half of her life and having to deal with all these things that she's never really had to think about before. And then how angry she is at the world for being so ableist, and how like she's navigating living essentially alone as a lesbian and her fears of the capabilities that she has been limited to. But it is a beautiful novel. It was pretty short and very, very compelling. Like, I was so gripped by this the entire way through, and we just see her journey into becoming a really full version of herself and to really embrace herself in the face of the really tough situation that she's in, of like getting broken up with from her long-term partner and then also getting MS like out of nowhere essentially. So I really, really loved this, and it's been ruminating in my mind ever since I read it like way earlier in the year. And it was so good, and I would definitely recommend it.